The phrase fuel supply drops overnight sounds like an accident, like something broke, a ship got delayed, a refinery tripped. That framing is comforting because accidents can be fixed, but this wasn't an accident. This was a reveal. What happened overnight is that California's gasoline system finally showed how thin, brittle, and exposed it has become after years of policy choices that steadily removed slack from the system. Here's the mechanism. California does not have a flexible fuel market. It's not Texas, it's not the Midwest, it's a semi-island. The state uses a special gasoline blend. It's largely cut off from interstate pipelines, and it relies heavily on a small number of in-state refineries running close to full capacity. That means when even one piece moves offline, or even prepares to move offline, the effects show up fast. Inventories drop, traders notice, prices jump, politicians panic. So when reports say the governor is scrambling, that's not because something unexpected happened last night. It's because something expected finally became visible enough that it could no longer be ignored. Refining capacity has been shrinking for years. Everyone involved knew this. Companies announced closures in advance. Analysts warned about tighter margins. But as long as the system didn't break publicly, it stayed abstract. Overnight drops turn abstraction into headlines. This is how political crises work in energy. Not when the policy is passed, not when the refinery announces it's idling. The crisis comes later, when the physical system responds. Fuel markets don't care about press releases or long-term targets. They care about barrels per day, storage levels, shipping schedules, and redundancy. California has been removing redundancy while telling itself that demand will magically fall fast enough to compensate. That assumption is now under stress. And notice the timing of the scramble. It doesn't happen when refineries announce they're shutting down years ahead of time. It doesn't happen when companies say explicitly, we will not reinvest here. It happens when prices threaten to spike and voters might notice. That tells you everything about incentives. The system is allowed to weaken quietly, but not to fail loudly. The governor's response, calling refiners, welcoming imports, reassuring the public, also tells a deeper story. For years, the political language has been about phasing out fossil fuels, disciplining oil companies, and forcing a transition through regulation. But when supply tightens, the rhetoric flips instantly. Suddenly, the same companies are partners. Imports are necessary. Continuity is the priority. That's not hypocrisy. It's structural reality asserting itself. Because here's the hard constraint. People still need fuel. Trucks still move goods. Construction still runs on diesel. Commuters still drive. You can want a transition, and many people do, but you cannot govern as if demand disappears on a schedule written into a policy document. If supply shrinks faster than demand, the gap doesn't vanish. It turns into scarcity, higher prices, and political backlash. That's why the word overnight matters. It gives the illusion of suddenness, but the system has been moving in this direction for a long time. Overnight is just when the buffer ran out. Think of it like a dam where water has been rising slowly for years. The breach looks sudden. The causes are not. And this is the deeper tension that part one is about. California has been trying to manage an energy transition by pressuring supply, not by building replacement capacity at scale first. That strategy only works if demand collapses quickly and smoothly. It hasn't. So instead, the state ends up in these moments where the governor has to step in, calm markets, and quietly do damage control with the very industry he's supposed to be sidelining. The scramble isn't a failure of leadership in the narrow sense. It's the predictable outcome of a system designed with no margin for error. And once you understand that, the real question stops being what went wrong last night and becomes why was the system built so that one shock, foreseen or not, could cause this much stress at all? That question leads directly to the refinery exits, the investment pullback, and the incentive structure that made this outcome not just possible, but likely. And that's where we go next. To understand why this system is so tight, you have to stop talking about gasoline in moral or symbolic terms and start talking about refineries as capital assets. Steel, concrete, pipes, permits, timelines. Refining capacity doesn't drift away. It is shut down deliberately after companies decide it no longer makes economic sense to keep operating or reinvesting. And in California, that decision has been getting easier every year. Refineries are not light switches. They require constant reinvestment just to stay compliant, let alone competitive. Equipment ages, environmental standards tighten, maintenance costs rise. Normally, companies justify those costs because they expect to earn returns over decades. That expectation is what keeps capital flowing. When that expectation disappears, so does investment. California has sent a very clear signal to refiners. This business has no long-term future here. The signal didn't come from a single law. It came from an accumulation of mandates, deadlines, lawsuits, uncertainty, and political messaging. Cap and trade costs, low carbon fuel standards, permitting delays, public hostility, repeated statements about phasing out oil and gas. Each one adds friction. Together, they tell executives, do not sink billions into assets that policymakers openly want gone. So what do companies do in that situation? They stop reinvesting. They run existing facilities harder, defer upgrades, and eventually decide to idle or close. That's not sabotage. That's rational behavior under uncertainty. If you know demand might still exist, but you're not allowed to earn stable returns supplying it, the smartest move is to minimize exposure. This is how nominal supply and reliable supply diverge. On paper, California still looks like it has refineries. In reality, it has fewer buffers, less redundancy, and older infrastructure being pushed to its limits. When one refinery goes down for maintenance or announces closure, there's no excess capacity waiting to step in. That's why every shutdown now feels like an emergency. And notice something important. Companies are not fleeing fuel demand. They're fleeing California refining. Many of the same firms are perfectly happy to refine elsewhere and ship product in. Why? Because importing gasoline carries fewer regulatory risks than producing it locally. No massive fixed assets subject to shifting state policy. No long-term exposure, just logistics. This is the quiet pivot that matters most. The state is not eliminating gasoline use, it is offshoring gasoline production. That changes everything. Imports are more expensive. They're exposed to shipping delays. They depend on global markets, and they weaken the state's ability to manage its own supply in a crisis. Supporters of current policy often respond, "Good, this accelerates the transition." But transitions only work if replacement systems are ready first. Electric vehicles are growing, but not nearly fast enough to offset refinery closures. Heavy-duty transport still runs on diesel. Aviation fuel has no scalable alternative. Construction, agriculture, emergency services all depend on petroleum products. These uses don't vanish because a refinery closes. They just become more expensive and more fragile. What's especially revealing is that many closures were announced years in advance. There was time to plan, time to coordinate, time to build alternatives or manage decline. But instead of treating refining as critical infrastructure that needed careful, sequenced transition planning, the state treated it as a political liability best squeezed until it gave way. Now it is giving way. This is where incentives matter more than intentions. You can want lower emissions and still need functioning supply systems. But if your policies make the supply side economically untenable before demand has structurally fallen, the The result is not a clean transition. It's a squeeze. And squeezed systems don't glide downward, they snap. So when you hear officials talk about refinery closures as isolated business decisions, understand what's really happening. This is a coordinated outcome produced by policy signals. No single regulator shut these plants down. The incentive structure did. And once enough firms make the same rational choice, the system reaches a tipping point. The state is now closer to that point than it wants to admit, which raises the next problem, because even if you accept this path, California's ability to rely on the rest of the country for backup is far weaker than people assume. And that geographic and infrastructural isolation turns what might be manageable elsewhere into a recurring crisis here. That's the next layer. At this point, some people say, fine, if California refines less, it can just buy fuel from somewhere else. That sounds reasonable until you look at the infrastructure, because California is not plugged into the U.S. fuel system the way most states are. It's not a free-flowing national market. It's a semi-isolated zone. And that isolation turns supply problems into price shocks very quickly. Start with pipelines. Most of the country is connected by dense networks that move gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel across regions. If a refinery goes down in one state, fuel can be redirected from another. That flexibility is what keeps disruptions from becoming crises. California largely lacks that option. There is no major pipeline bringing large volumes of finished gasoline from the Gulf Coast or the Midwest into the state. Geography, environmental opposition, and past political decisions all but guaranteed that. So when in-state refining shrinks, California doesn't tap the national supply. It turns outward to ships, tankers from Asia, the Gulf Coast, or Latin America. That is a fundamentally different supply model. Marine imports are slower. They are scheduled weeks in advance. They are exposed to weather, port congestion, and global price swings. And they don't respond well to sudden demand or inventory drops. This is where inventories matter. Gasoline prices don't spike because stations run dry. They spike when traders see inventories falling toward uncomfortable levels. Even a small drop can move prices if the system has no quick way to replenish supply. In California, inventories act like a warning gauge. When they dip, everyone knows there's no fast fix. That expectation alone pushes prices higher. And imports shift bargaining power. When you rely on distant suppliers, you lose leverage. You are no longer negotiating from a position of, we produce most of what we use. You are competing with other buyers in global markets. If another region is willing to pay more, shipments get diverted. That's not price gouging, it's how commodity markets work. The costs of that system don't hit everyone equally. Large oil companies can manage volatility. They hedge, they arbitrage. Small fuel distributors can't, truckers can't, independent gas stations can't. They feel the squeeze first. Higher wholesale prices get passed down the chain, and by the time it reaches consumers, it shows up as sudden jumps at the pump. This also explains why California price spikes look so dramatic compared to other states. Elsewhere, supply disruptions are cushioned by pipelines and spare capacity. In California, the cushion is gone. Every disruption becomes a test of how fast ships can arrive and at what price. That's not resilience. That's vulnerability. Now layer politics on top of that. When prices rise, the state has limited tools. It can jawbone refiners. It can release statements. It can ask for imports, but it can't command ships to arrive faster, and it can't force global prices lower. The real control points, the infrastructure and investment decisions, were set years earlier. And this is where the system becomes self-reinforcing. Higher volatility discourages reinvestment even more. Why put capital into a refinery serving a market that's politically hostile and structurally unstable? So the import share grows, the local base shrinks further, and the system becomes even more sensitive to shocks. Each cycle makes the next one worse. What you're seeing now is not just the consequence of fewer refineries. It's the consequence of replacing a relatively stable local production system with a long exposed supply chain. That choice doesn't eliminate fossil fuels. It just makes access to them more precarious and more expensive. And that brings us to the political problem this creates for leadership. Because once fuel becomes scarce or volatile, the question is no longer about long-term climate goals. It becomes immediate: who gets protected, who pays more, and who absorbs the anger when scarcity has to be managed instead of avoided. That's the bind the governor is now in, and that's where this goes next. Once fuel scarcity becomes visible, the governor's problem stops being ideological and starts being managerial. You're no longer talking about climate targets in 2040. You're dealing with price boards changing in real time, angry commuters, small businesses watching margins disappear, and truckers who can't just wait for the transition. This is where politics collides with physical systems, and physical systems usually win. The bind is simple. On one side, the administration has spent years framing oil companies as obstacles, profiteers, or actors that must be constrained to force change. On the other side, when supply tightens, those same companies suddenly become essential partners. Phone calls get made, public tone softens, import decisions are praised. The message shifts from discipline to cooperation overnight. That reversal isn't accidental. It's baked into scarcity management. When there isn't enough supply, someone has to decide who gets what, at what price, and under what conditions. Markets do this automatically through prices. Politicians try to manage the fallout, usually by pretending the market outcome is temporary, abnormal, or the result of bad behavior rather than structural design. This is where emergency measures appear. Meetings with refiners, appeals for voluntary production increases, statements about monitoring prices. All of it signals concern without admitting causation. Because admitting causation would mean acknowledging that years of policy choices narrowed the system's tolerance for disruption. That's not a comfortable admission for any administration. The losers in this phase are predictable: drivers with no alternatives, workers whose jobs require mobility, small firms that can't pass on higher fuel costs. They absorb the shock directly. The winners are fewer and quieter: firms that can arbitrage scarcity, traders positioned for volatility, and large players with enough scale to ride out price swings. Environmental advocates face their own dilemma here. Scarcity does not automatically equal decarbonization. In practice, it often creates backlash. When people experience policy through higher living costs rather than visible alternatives, support erodes. That's how climate policy becomes politically fragile, not because people reject the goal, but because they reject the method. The governor's options are constrained. He can't order refineries to reopen. He can't force investors to commit capital for decades in a market signaling exit. He can't instantly build replacement infrastructure. So the response becomes tactical: stabilize prices, prevent shortages, and push the political reckoning into the future. This is why the language stays vague. Officials talk about working with stakeholders, ensuring supply, and protecting consumers. What they avoid saying is that the system now depends on goodwill from an industry being told it has no future. That contradiction doesn't resolve itself. It just gets managed crisis by crisis. And each crisis shifts the political landscape. Every scramble teaches voters that fuel reliability is not guaranteed. Every price spike reframes the transition as something happening to them, not for them. That doesn't stop change, but it shapes how hard and how chaotic that change becomes. So part 4 is really about this. Once you're managing scarcity instead of abundance, your power as a policymaker shrinks. You're reacting, not steering. You're choosing between bad options, not designing good ones. And that's a dangerous place to be in a system as essential as energy. Because if this is the pattern now, shrinking local supply, heavier reliance on imports, periodic scrambles to prevent backlash, the question isn't whether this will happen again. The question is how often and how severe the next one will be. And that's the reckoning waiting in the final part. What this episode ultimately shows is not a one-off failure, but a trajectory. Once a fuel system enters this phase, shrinking local capacity, rising import dependence, and political crisis management, it doesn't stabilize on its own. It becomes more fragile over time. Each closure raises the stakes of the next disruption. Each scramble normalizes emergency governance, and each price shock teaches markets to expect volatility. If more refineries exit or further scale down, the math gets worse fast. Fewer plants mean fewer maintenance windows can be absorbed. A single unplanned outage becomes system-wide stress. Imports fill some of the gap, but they don't restore resilience. They replace controllable local production with distant, price-sensitive supply. That's not a bridge. It's a downgrade. This is where the illusion of control breaks down. Policymakers often assume they can manage decline smoothly, nudge demand down, pressure supply, and let the market adjust. But energy systems don't glide. They operate on thresholds. As long as capacity barely meets demand, everything looks fine. Once it doesn't, the system snaps into scarcity. And scarcity rewrites politics overnight. The deeper lesson is about sequencing. Transitions that work build replacement capacity first, then retire old systems. Transitions that fail do it in reverse. California has leaned heavily toward the second model, constraining fossil fuel supply in anticipation of demand reduction that has not yet materialized at scale. The result isn't faster decarbonization. It's higher costs, higher volatility, and growing resistance. None of this means the transition is impossible. It means the current path is unstable. Electrification has to move faster before supply is removed. Grid capacity, charging infrastructure, and affordability have to precede forced scarcity. Otherwise, the public experiences the transition not as progress, but as punishment. And there's a political consequence here that's easy to underestimate. Energy instability erodes trust. When people see leaders oscillate between condemnation and cooperation with the same industry, they stop believing the narrative. They conclude, often correctly, that the system is being improvised. That creates openings for backlash, rollbacks, or abrupt policy reversals that help no one. So the real warning in this fuel drop is not about gasoline prices next week. It's about path dependence. Once you lock into a system that runs hot, with no slack and no redundancy, you are choosing repeated crises as your governing environment. You are betting that you can manage public anger indefinitely, while the physical system tightens. History suggests that's a bad bet. Energy transitions succeed when they are boring, when people barely notice them. They fail when they become visible through price spikes, shortages, and emergency meetings. California is drifting toward the second category. And that's the final point. This was not the last scramble. It was a preview. Unless the underlying structure changes, either by rebuilding supply resilience or accelerating replacement capacity far faster, the system will keep delivering these moments. Not overnight accidents, but predictable consequences.